So, if y'all want to go ahead and start turning your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2, that's where we're going to kind of do a deep dive this morning. Somebody asked me earlier, it's like, hey, why are you here? I have no idea. I guess Jason was dead. I don't know. My wife and I live in Murphy, Texas. Anybody live in Murphy, Texas or know where that is? It's a little bit down 190. I grew up in Garland, Texas, became a believer in high school. Go G-Town. What's the Garland High School? G-Town? G what?
G-Town!
G what? G-Town? G what? Okay, anyway. So, lived in Murphy for about 15 years. My wife, Allie, she'll actually be with us with my two daughters, second service. It's like herding cats sometimes in the mornings. I was told not to stand there because there's no light on my face, so I'll move over here. I work for a company called Oxano. We are a ministry that was founded by a guy named Will Mancini about 15 years ago. Our parent company is a company called Lifeway Christian Resources, if you've been through the Lifeway Christian bookstores or whatever. So that's our parent company. My job at Oxano is I have the privilege to literally travel the world and I travel the country with Oxano. I serve on the board of a missions agency, and I serve on the board of our international board. And I literally have the privilege of traveling and seeing God do amazing things all over the world. It's a very unique perspective. I love what I do, but there's something that I don't like about what I do. Is I'm a really bad churchgoer. When I started traveling and working with churches, what happened is it became very difficult for me to dig in deeply into a church. And so I'm kind of cruising along as angst is building. I'm just kind of confession mode to you right now. So fast forward a few years and this angst is building and building, and a guy named Jason Collins calls into Oxano. He says, hey, getting ready to do this leadership conference thing. Want to know if Will Mancini, our founder, is available. And turns out there's a conflict that day. Will says, hey, I'm not available, but there's a guy who lives in your area named Will Heath. And so Jason and I ended up connecting. I ended up doing that conference. How many of you were in the room at that conference? Raise your hands. Okay, so you guys, so I've met the folks raising your hands already. Well, I just want to tell you, kind of what I told our team at an annual retreat, what I told the Oxano team is I feel personally like I am committing spiritual voyeurism. Meaning, I live vicariously through the stories of what God is doing through other churches. And here's the reality, full-on confession mode. Even though I'm like a professional holy guy, I've been in ministry for over 20 years. I just want to tell you, when I got around Jason and I started hearing about Crossroads, these guys started pricking my heart again. And I just, from a distance, and my family and I, we've been involved in a church for a long time in Wiley, but we're making the transition. We're looking forward to being involved with Crossroads. This is going to be our home. We're making that transition slowly, just because there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. We've been in the church for a long time. We love them deeply. But sitting down with Jason earlier this year, and I get to know your leaders, and I'm hearing the stories, and I just want to tell you what a blessing your church is to me. I feel like for the first time in a few years since I've been doing full-time consulting, I feel like my toes are kind of dipping up, and I'm just excited about ministry, and I see a pathway for me to engage my giftedness in a local church, and I just want to tell you what I love watching you worship. I love that we mess up in the singing this morning, and it's okay. I'm serious. Like, guys, in October, I'll be with a church of 15,000 people. Man, everything's like on point. Everything's perfect. I see that all the time. And I'm just like, I just want to be around real people of Jesus.
Amen.
Amen. You know what I'm saying? Like, we can be so professional sometimes. I have become so professional in my faith And I just want to confess, part of my story right now, real time, is I'm so jealous, and I think in a godly way, but I'm so jealous about what you are doing as a church, and I just want to be a part of it. And so today, we're continuing the story. I want to get into a little bit more of my story on the back end of this. But today, last week Jason gave a kind of an overview of the first 4 chapters in Exodus. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant, okay? It was amazing, but it's kind of this theme is being able to share your story. Because like he says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, it's like we need to be ready to give an account for our stories. Amen? To always be able to tell people what God's doing in us and through us. And so today, how we're going to kind of unpack this story is we're going to do a real deep dive into Exodus chapter 2. And we're going to look at the story of Moses leading up to the calling of Moses at the burning bush. So Jason talked about that last week. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 2. Now, normally, I use the ESV version of the Bible. You know what that stands for? It's the extra spiritual version. But because we're in the Old Testament, we're going to use the Bible Light, or the Message, right? It's kind of a paraphrased version, but it's so readable. And literally, unless you have a Message Bible, I wouldn't recommend that you look through your Bible because you're going to be lost in the phraseology a little bit. But we're going to tell the story that's going to be up on the screen. You guys just follow along. We're going to pull out a couple of nuggets as we look deeply at what's going on in Moses' story. And then at the end of that, I just want to connect the dots with me personally. And then this week, as you're meeting in your life groups, talking about unpacking how God is putting His imprint on you and how your story is taking place. So let's go ahead and get started. Exodus chapter 1, it's the last verse in Exodus chapter 1. And we know the backdrop here, right? It says, so Pharaoh issued a general order to all the people. Now this is, talk about sexism. There we go. Every boy that is born, drown him in the Nile. But the girls can live. I just want to tell you, I feel a little pressure coming from that verse. So what we have at the end of Exodus chapter 1, macro level context, what's happening is if there's something going on, we'll get to it here in a little bit, but Israel's beginning to be a really big nation. It's kind of freaking Pharaoh out. It's like, hey, we got to put an end to this. Kill all the dudes. The girls can go. And we jump over to chapter 2. You go from context, big macro level. Now we're really diving into the specific story of Moses, and we're familiar with this. A man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. A Levi was simply a tribe. They were one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the woman became pregnant and had a son. I love this. She saw that there was something special about him. And she hid him for 3 months. Because of this decree, she had to hide him. And when she couldn't hide him any longer, she got a little basket boat made of papyrus, wood-proofed it with tar and pitch, and placed the child in it. And she set it afloat in the reeds at the edge of the Nile. I'm wondering what that must have felt like for a mama to send her baby down the riverbanks. The baby's older sister, we would find out that is Miriam later. She was a significant figure in the formation of Israel, Moses' older sister. The baby's older sister found herself a vantage point a little way off and watched to see what would happen to him. Is he going to drown? Is he going to get eaten by an alligator? I love my brother. What's going on? And I begin to see God inserting Himself. And listen to this. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile to bathe. Her maidens strolled on the bank. She saw this basket boat floating in the reeds and sent her maid to get it. She opened it and saw the child, the baby crying. Her heart went out to him and she said, "This must be one of the Hebrew babies." And then check this out. Remember who's got a vantage point paying attention. Then his sister was before her. She was paying attention. She was watching. Do you want me to go get a nursing mother from the Hebrews so she can nurse the baby for you? Pharaoh's daughter said, "Yes, go." The girl went and got the child's mom. Now, it gets even better. The Pharaoh's daughter told her, "Take this baby and nurse him. I'll pay you." And the woman took the child and nursed him. Imagine what's happening in Moses' mother's heart right now. The king had issued a decree where where the baby would have to be killed. She hides the baby, puts him in a boat, floats him down the river, and the next thing you know, she's being paid to actually take care of her new child. Amen. God indeed does some crazy things as He writes our stories. And after the child was weaned, the mom, she presented him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses, pulled out saying, I pulled him out of the water. And then we get to verse 11, and if we're not careful, we can just read right past this verse. Time passed, Moses grew up. Time passed, Moses grew up. So literally in one verse's time, we go from baby being weaned to a man that is 40 years old. And the question that we must wrestle with when we're looking at the story of Moses, this man that God is preparing to do something quite significant, what's the story? Listen to how Stephen talks about Moses in Acts chapter 7 when Stephen is giving a speech. It says, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Moses was not a kid. He was not even a young man. Moses, by this time, had fully stepped into his career as a member of the royal family. And what was happening in Egypt during this time in history? They were building stuff like pyramids. This culture in all of world history is one of the most significant cultures when you look at all of the science, when you look at the thought leadership. I mean, scientists today are still trying to crack the code of how the Egyptians actually worked. And who was in the middle of all of this watching all of it play out? Moses. So what's happening with Moses while he's in Egypt? He's being educated in the best schools. He's understanding how to do project management. And oh, by the way, he has a front row seat and he's seeing what it looks like to literally run a country. And if we're not careful and we don't actually use our brains sometimes when we engage the Bible, we can miss out on some very subtle things. But here's one of the first things I want to point out. Sometimes in our own life, we can go through long periods of time, let's be honest, and it feels like God isn't doing a dang thing. Amen. Moses goes 40 years. Somewhere along the way, he finds out he's not an Egyptian. Somewhere along the way, he finds out that the nation that the Egyptians had been oppressing to actually build the cities and build the highways and do all the labor, somewhere along the way, Moses found out that he was actually a Hebrew. Back to verse 11, time passed and he grew up. And one day, he went and saw his brothers. Saw all that hard work. Then he saw an Egyptian hit a Hebrew, one of the Levites. He looked this way and then that. And when he realized that there was no one in sight, he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. Moses, great, highly educated, great experience, the pressure, the realization that he was actually part of the problem. He was one of the oppressors. Finally got to it, and he's walking through the village, wherever he's at. Probably not the first time he's done it. Probably not the first time he's been exposed to the reality that his brothers, his kindred, are actually being hurt and bruised. He sees it. Something triggers in him, and he can't take it anymore, and he snaps, and he kills the Egyptian. Buries him in the sand, thinking nobody saw. But let's keep reading. The next day, not even 24 hours later, he's walking out again. Two Hebrew men were fighting. He spoke to them as the one who started, says, "Why are you hitting your neighbor?" The man shot back, "Who do you think you are, telling us what to do? Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" He was outed. Apparently, when he looked around the previous day, he didn't see somebody that was watching. And here's the deal. Remember, Moses was weaned by his mother. You remember Moses' sister went down the river and saw her baby brother taken by the princess and knew that her brother was actually adopted into the royal family. Word's probably getting out a little bit that there's a Hebrew in the palace. And this guy comes walking through. No doubt let's not fool ourselves. It's hard to keep secrets, right? There's something going on. And so not only, hey, who are you, you Hebrew? You got to understand, there's got to be some animosity. Maybe these guys don't know it, but somebody does. That there's a Hebrew in the palace. We're getting beat. We're getting bruised. We're being abused. We're building all this stuff. We're not getting paid well, but there's a Hebrew in the palace. And he's going to tell us what to do? How dare you? Can you imagine the range of emotion that Moses must have felt in this moment? The day before, he killed a man, probably feeling the guilt from that, lashing out in anger. Today, he's being rejected by his brethren. And oh, by the way, there's this little thing called fear creeping in. Then Moses panicked. Words gotten out. People knew about this. Pharaoh heard about it and tried to kill Moses. Being an adopted boy in the family didn't carry him very far, did it? But Moses got away to the land of Midian. He sat down by a wall. Now, I want to show you something here. Pull up that map. Now, I went to this thing called Google. It's like, where did Moses go? I mean, think about that. Like, he killed a dude. The next day, he gets outed for it. And then he just hightails it to Midian. That's not like, Wes, if I killed you, bro. I love you, but I killed you. Let's say you're dead. I'm going to hightail it to Dallas. It's not like that. The top left over here, if you can see it, is kind of the closest thing on the top left where this big green patch is. That's the Nile River Delta. And Cairo is the starting spot. Moses would have been somewhere near Cairo at this point. A little bit east of Cairo. Midian, if he took a plane, it's only a 2.5-hour drive. If he goes the north side route, it's a 26-hour drive, about 2,200 kilometers. It's about 1,400 miles. Moses goes 1,400 miles. He crosses over Iraq, and he ends up in Saudi Arabia. That's Basra, right there in the southeastern corner of Iraq. And Midian is what is today Saudi Arabia. When Moses went on this trek, guys, it would have taken him anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks to show up. And he just hightailed it. So guess what he doesn't have anymore? Money. Guess what he doesn't have? A network. His Hebrew brothers just rejected him. The Pharaoh's trying to kill him. I want you to imagine he's crossing a pretty vast desert. Pull out, do that next slide, give you a little more scope. He's going from Cairo, over to Iran as modern day Midian. And something happens. He sat down by this well. Next verse. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. God bless him. And I'm not being sarcastic, that's awesome. Really, really. They came and drew water, filling the troughs and watering their father's sheep. When the shepherds came and chased the girls off, Moses came to their rescue and helped them water their sheep. When they had got home to their father, this is another name for Jethro. If you remember, Jethro is actually Moses' father-in-law. That didn't take very long. Why are you back so soon? An Egyptian. They don't know he's a Hebrew. An Egyptian. They said, rescued us from a bunch of shepherds. Why? He even drew the water for us and he watered the sheep. He said, so where is he? Why did you leave him behind? Invite him so he can have something to eat with us. Moses agreed to settle down there with the man. And check this out. You run off some shepherds, you get a wife. Right? This man who then gave his daughter Zipporah, which means bird to him, for his wife. And check this out. She had a son, and Moses named him Gershom, which means sojourn, saying, I am a sojourner in a foreign country. This word sojourner is a really interesting thing. It's an interesting word. It's used several times throughout the Old Testament. One way to understand what this word means, Moses is basically a refugee. One way to understand what this Hebrew word sojourn means, insert the phrase fear walk. Moses was literally going on a fear walk. He had no idea where he was going. He was running from the place he was just exiled from. He had no idea where his provision was coming from. He's got all this education, but he doesn't have a very good resume at this point. And when he has a son, he names his son Fear Walk, as this mark and this symbol of what had characterized his life in those recent years. Bless you. You're welcome. So we saw what was going on with Moses in Egypt. What's going on with Moses in the desert was a couple of things. His father is a rancher, right? Father-in-law is a rancher. He's part of the family business, and he's learning what it means to hurt a bunch of creatures that don't listen. You ever hang around sheep? Stupid animals. You read about Israel walking through the desert and kind of scratch your head. Put our head on a swivel. I'll put my head on a swivel and look back in my life. I've done some stupid stuff. Maybe you have done the same thing. So Moses is getting an education front and center. What it means to lead a bunch of creatures that don't listen. He's learning how to find water in the desert. He's learning how to find food. He's learning how to navigate the terrain. Can you see what God's doing here? Now, this is another one of those things like in chapter 2 earlier where it says, and then he grew up. 40 years pass, and we don't get just a lot of detail about what's happening, but if we use our brain and we understand that Moses is a shepherd in the desert, we can see that God is indeed setting something up. So the question is, what's God doing in Egypt? We talked about Moses. What's God doing in Egypt? God's fulfilling a promise. If we go back to Genesis chapter 12, it's the Abrahamic covenant. Or before we do that, let's look at verse 24. It said, God remembered his covenant with Abram, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God's remembering a promise that he made years before. And so what is that promise? Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. God basically said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a bunch of kids, you're going to birth a nation, and I'm going to use this nation to be a blessing to the entire world. I'm going to create a nation to demonstrate who I am to the nations. We know that in the Old Testament as Hebrews. We know that in the New Testament as the church. Our job is to represent. We are a royal nation, a holy priesthood. God created us to represent him to the nation. So God made that promise, Genesis chapter 2, or chapter 12. Now let's fast forward, go back to the beginning of the story, and ask the question, why in the world did Pharaoh freak out and want to start killing all the kids? 400 years Hebrews had lived in Egypt. So go back to Exodus chapter 1. A new king came to power who didn't know Joseph. And if you remember Joseph, the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? Remember that story? Yeah. That's Joseph. It's number 2 in the nation at that time in Egypt. He spoke to his people in alarm. There are way too many of these Israelites for us to handle. We've got to do something. Let's devise a plan to contain them, lest if there's a war, they should join our enemies or just walk off and leave. So they organized them into work gangs and put them into hard labor under gang foremen. They built the storage cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. Pithom and Ramses would have been next to Cairo geographically, just to the east. But the harder the Egyptians worked them, the more the children of Israel had children everywhere. God is remembering his promise to make a nation. In over 400 years in Egypt, God is fulfilling his promise. That is what God is doing in Egypt. What's God doing in the desert? He's preparing a leader. He's working behind the scenes, and he's equipping a leader. There's two big takeaways I want to give you from this story. Number one, we can't separate the situation God uses from the lesson he teaches. I gave you number two first. Point number one. See, that's why I love you guys. You're okay with that. It's not that number one, it's not that God inserts himself into our story. It's about the way he opens our eyes to his. You ever feel like God is not with you? You ever been going through stuff and you feel like God just kind of forgot you? I've been there. I'm driving down the road about 15 years ago and I decided to cuss God out because he wasn't doing anything. Next day I woke up and said, God, I'm sorry. My bad. He's always working. The problem is we're not always seeing. 40 years God was working behind the scenes. Israel in the moment couldn't see it. 40 years God is preparing Moses on the back 40. Moses couldn't see it in the moment, but God was working. Point number two, we can't separate the situation God uses from the lesson he teaches. See, it's in the backdrop of our brokenness that we experience his grace. And we see that his ways are indeed better than ours. The problem is complaining and arrogance yield the same result. Clogged ears and closed eyes. You can literally be walking through hell right now, and if you curse the situation you're in, you will move the hand of God. You will miss the hand of God in it. Things can be going incredibly well, and you might actually think you're responsible for that. And you can miss the provision of God. And you can miss what he's trying to teach you in that moment. It's not about God inserting himself in our story. It's about the way he opens our eyes to his story. And we can't separate the situation God uses from the lesson he teaches. But I'll just want to admit some of us have harder situations than others. Life isn't fair, is it? Some people in this room are sick. Others aren't. Some people in this room have experienced broken marriages. Others haven't. Some people in this room are struggling to paycheck to paycheck, and others have plenty of money in the bank. Some of us are white and really haven't ever understood what it means to be looked at different. Some of us are not white, and we feel that tension every day. It's not fair. Life isn't fair. The opportunity for us to actually see collectively what's happening depends on our ability to let our eyes rise above our context and actually see and believe and trust that God is deeply at work. So that's what's going on with Moses. I'm going to tell you my story real quick. So I grew up in Texas, but I was born in Oklahoma. OKC, baby. Any Okies in the house?
Yep. Go Folks.
Go Oklahoma. Have an Allen boy throw Oklahoma Sooners.
Oklahoma State.
No, get out. Leave. Got a couple of Allen kids starting to make their stamp on OU football. Anyway, it's a different story. So I was born in Oklahoma, lived there a whopping 2 months of my life when my mom and my dad relocated our family down to Houston, Texas. So here's the deal. When my dad married my mom, he surprised her with a destination wedding. So wish my wife and I would have done that. It would have been so much stress-free. Anyway, they go to Mexico. And they get that marriage certificate in Spanish. It's romantic. Get back and realize the reason that they had to get married in Mexico was because he was already married here. I am literally the definition of a bastard. I'm a fatherless child. When his other wife finally caught up to my mom and my brother and sister in Houston, he bailed. Mom, older brother and sister live in a tar paper shack in Houston, Texas. My uncle finds out, drives from Garland, Texas, gets her in a car, drives her up, helps her get a house, co-signs an old FHA assumable loan. And we live from the day I moved there when I was around 2 years old to the time that I got married. I either lived at 1532 Elizabeth Drive in Garland, Texas, or a dorm room. See, and here's the deal about my mom. My mom pulls 0 punches. I knew that story in elementary school. 3rd grade, 4th grade, my mom's paying the bills. She lines up her paycheck. How many show your kid your paycheck? My mom's just weird like that. She showed her paycheck, laid out the bills, and she would take me and I would work the calculator. We'd go to her paycheck, gross, not net, type in the number, times 0.10 equals. She would take her check. She would write out a check to Jupiter Road Baptist Church, and she would tear it off. She would set that thing aside, and she said, Willie, that's the Lord's. It's the first check we always write. That's not ours. That's His. Amen. And then we would go look at the checkbook and the other bills, and sometimes when I would do the math, money would run out before bills. But that was how I grew up. Father's Day sucked for me. Hated it. My mom, I don't remember this. My mom told me one time on the way from church on a Father's Day, she said, I don't care how much it costs. I want a dad. But I wasn't alone. I had men who weren't biologically responsible for me, but I had men who inserted themselves in my life just because they could, just because they would. And so growing up without a dad, having older guys step into my life, I developed a deep affinity for relationships with older men. That still carries today. Some of my most trusted friends are guys that are 20 to 30 years older than me. I love those are my closest friends. It's weird. I have a few close friends my age. Most of my friends have a lot more gray than I do. So that's my story, right? I become a banker. I do bivocational ministry while in banking. And one of my mentors happens to be a guy that was the pastor at First Baptist Church of Rowlett for 22 years, Dr. Stephen Leatherwood. I go to lunch with Dr. Stephen Leatherwood about 10 years ago. We're sitting at lunch. I said, hey, Stephen, man, when it's time for you to retire, man, what do you do? Like, you're the chaplain, the police department, the fire department, the high school football team. When you're no longer the lead pastor, you're not going to just bail on the community. What does that look like for you? Guys, he cried for 2 hours because he didn't have an answer to that question. I didn't realize as a 30-year-old dude, you're not supposed to ask that kind of stuff. But I did. And I was his guy. 2 hours he cries, talking to me about that. 3 months later, a buddy of mine calls me up and says, hey, Will, I'm getting ready to start this private bank in Dallas, and I'd love to know if you would be willing to come on board. And one of the things I want you to do is help us to figure out how to give away a bunch of money. Our annual budget to give away was $2 million. We gave away as much money in Dallas as Bank of America, and I was the guy on the team that helped figure out how to give away that money. Worst job I've ever had, honestly. I can tell you about it over beers later if you drink. Sorry. See, it's another reason I love you guys. 3 months after this conversation with Stephen Leatherwood, I start this job. 9 months into that job, I've been to over 200 site visits for nonprofits. And I saw, guys, in that moment, transitions playing out left and right. That was about 10 years ago. This thing called succession planning was kind of on the back of my brain. It started doing some stuff in me. And so here's what God began to do. God put me in a situation, context, so I could get an education on succession planning. Guess what I do today? 10 years later, I had no clue what God was doing in that moment. 10 years later, I make a living doing that. And I don't mean this in an arrogant way, guys. I'm the only person in the country that does what I do. And I work with churches that range from 70 in membership all the way up to 15 to 20,000 in membership. It's not a bragging statement on me, it's a bragging statement on God. Who would have thought that a conversation with a mentor who I only had because I was trying to fill a hole of fatherhood in my life, God redeeming that, working behind the scenes, gives me the audacity to ask a pretty direct question. That turns into a 2-hour conversation. A few months later, God puts me at a bank, and I see transitions play out, which forms the basis for what I do today. Guys, you can't write this stuff. That's my story, part of it anyway. And so here's the question. Guys, you want to come on up? I want us to think about something. And especially for those of you in the room who are going through some stuff, marriage issues, kid issues, whatever it is. Here's the thing, here's the big thing I just want us to process together as a people. Is it possible? In fact, isn't it even probable that even though we can't see what's happening, that God is working? Is it possible that whatever you're going through right now, God's positioning you to be able to tell your story about how He sustained you through the broken or how He humbled you in your provision? So that you and I, our stories can continually point people to the reality and the working, the majesty and the power of God to work in our lives. Could it be that God's doing something in you to position you so that you can be ready to give an account? And I want to be as direct and loving as I can. If you don't understand your story, you are not stewarding the work that God has been doing in your life deeply. You're wasting the blessing of His working behind the scenes if you are not being serious about taking a look at how God is moving in you and around you.